Council of Governments. I would like to thank you all for joining us today for this Housing Coffee Hour about the connection between housing and school enrollment. We have Dr. Don Poland, a trusted and knowledgeable planner, here with us today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items to help you get the most out of today's session. We encourage you to engage with us and ask us questions throughout the webinar. To do this, please feel free to use the chat box. We will watch the chat box, and then we will have time for a Q&A session at the end, in which myself and Desiree Blanchard will go through your questions. This session is being recorded. We will send out a link of the recording and the PowerPoint after the webinar so that you can watch it at your convenience or share it with colleagues who aren't able to make it today. But thank you from everyone that is here. It looks like we've got really great representation from across our region and our state. And I will pass it over to Dr. Don Poland to introduce himself.
Thanks, SN. I appreciate that. Good morning, everyone. My name is Don Poland. I'm with the firm of Gilman York Property Advisors. I've been a professional planner now for about 30 years, and for about 20 years of that time now, I've been doing a lot of work around housing and school enrollment and municipal fiscal impacts. And I'd like to share today kind of some of the big picture demographic trends, how they relate ultimately to housing and ultimately to school enrollments and municipal fiscal impacts. I will caveat that, every community is different and has a degree of uniqueness in their circumstances. But that being said, these large demographic trends weigh heavily on all of our communities. So with that said, general introduction. The aim of this presentation is to explore Connecticut school district enrollments in the context of demographics and housing. A few things that I think we need to understand. There's a symbiotic relationship between economics and demographics. That is, when jobs stagnate, population stagnates, and a population begins to age. When population ages, population growth slows. And when population growth slows, household formations also tend to slow. There is a caveat to that I'll touch on later on, and housing demand ultimately slows. Jobs, population, and household formations are the primary drivers of real property markets, especially housing markets. And Connecticut becomes interesting because we've really had stagnant job growth and anemic population growth for over 30 years now. So from the period from 1985 to 1990, that's just 5 years, Connecticut added 103,000 new jobs. However, from 1990 to 2020, and that's a January 1st of 2020 pre-COVID number, Connecticut's non-farm employment increased by only 45,000. That is the stagnation, that difference between 100,000+ in 5 years and 45,000 in 30 years. With that comes demographic changes, and we'll talk a bit about that. In the context of housing and school district enrollments, over the course of my career, I've encountered a lot of common assumptions. That is that new housing development is the primary driver of school district enrollments. There's this assumption that all new housing units will produce 2 or more school-age children or 2 or more enrollments. And it's assumed that that is the driver of education costs and the creation of a fiscal burden on the municipality. There's also an assumption that each new enrollment costs that $20,000 plus or minus, which is dividing the entire Board of Ed budget by the total enrollment, and this idea that for every student we add, it's going to cost us that much money. When in fact, demographics, especially household structure, are the primary drivers of school district enrollments. Housing versus enrollments. For example, Connecticut has 1.4 million housing units or occupied households. in 512,000 school district enrollments. That works out to 0.357 enrollments per housing unit. That number alone destroys this idea that we're going to get 2 or more students or even 1 or more students per housing unit developed. The total per pupil expenditures also overestimate the cost of new enrollments. Between 40 and 50% of education budgets are not impacted by new enrollments. The actual cost of a new enrollment is around $8,000. I've had communities challenge my numbers and get numbers from their BOEs as low as $6,200 per new enrollment and as high as around $11,000 per new enrollment. So 8,000 is probably a good estimate there. Fixed expenditures on things like utilities, maintenance, administration, your front office, district office. You don't add a new superintendent every time you add an enrollment. You never add a new superintendent. Even teaching staff, let's say 26 new enrollments out of 100 housing units. Well, that's 26 students spread across 14 grades, pre-K, K, and then 1 through 12. The chances of having the need for a new hire teacher, even in that scenario, is very little. And that's why the per pupil on new enrollments is much lower. So conceptualizing some demographic change in school district enrollments. This is my childhood neighborhood. And this is 1976. I would have been 6 years old. And these 34 housing units produce 73 school district enrollments. If you look here, there were houses with 8 children, 6 children. And that works out to 2.4 enrollments per housing unit. I think this is why we think we have this past memory of lots of children. I think this is why we think that every new housing unit is going to add 2 or more enrollments. This is that same neighborhood today. My mom still lives there, and 34 houses are only producing 14 enrollments, or 0.41 per housing unit. Since these homes were constructed in 1950s and 60s, 8 of these homes have never produced a school district enrollment. I think that's important to understand. A house can go through, 70 years of a life cycle without producing any enrollments. And since 1970, this town has built 1 new elementary school in the early 70s, but has since closed 4 elementary schools and a middle school. And that's a phenomenon that many communities are experiencing. So why? What caused this change in the number of children and enrollments per household? And the answer is actually demographics. So national perspective on demographic trends, and then I'll work down to the state perspective, and then I'll provide you with some local examples. So demographic transition model tells us how a population grows. And if we look here in stage 1, you have high birth rates, high death rates. So actually population doesn't grow very much. When death rates start to decrease, if you do this broad picture population, medical innovations, penicillin, and antibiotics, and then things like pesticides, and so forth that knock down things like malaria. We see death rate drop, birth rate stays high, and you have huge population growth. When you get to stage 3, the birth rate starts coming down. That's with an advanced technological society, an industrialized society, or a post-industrialized. And then as birth rates decrease and level out with death rates, you end up in stage 4 and then stage 5. And you have this idea of the population pyramid. High growth places that correlate with economics, typically poor economics, show a pyramid, and then populations as they hit stage 4 and 5 become into silos. Rate of natural increase is births or fertility when they exceed mortality deaths. In the total fertility rate, the average number of children a woman will have through her childbearing years is actually more accurate of a measure than the birth rate itself. And when we're talking about this, we're excluding immigration. So you can have a population that's contracting based on birth rates and fertility rates, but is still growing in total numbers due to immigration. And I'll touch on that a bit later also. So just some big picture international examples here. US, post-industrialized, advanced society, high net worth, GDP, income, and you see a siloing versus, say, Somalia, a developing nation with little economic, prosperity, and you still see the very high birth rates, very high death rates, and therefore the population pyramid. Japan, like US, as an advanced society, is in population implosion. They are aging rapidly, they are not having children, and that pyramid has inverted upside down. Russia, another story, but disrupted growth, and we can talk about that another day. So, United States population pyramid 1980. You see the pyramid at the top end, and you see this large bulge here. This is kind of the baby boom generation. And we were in a growth state. You now jump ahead to the 2030 projection, and you see the US population has siloed. So we're seeing a move from kind of stage 3-ish to stage 4-ish, and maybe a stage 5. I'm not convinced though. So fertility rates, a lot of information on this slide, but for a fertility rate, if you have 2 people to produce a child, you would think you need 2 children to sustain the population. You actually need between 2.1 and 2.3 for a fertility rate for the population to remain stable, because there's women that don't have children, there's women that can't have children, and there are births of females that never make it to fertility age to have children. So that's why somewhere between 2.1 and 2.3 maintains a stable population. In 2018, the US was at 1.73, well below replacement. And most notably, below 1.7 is typically viewed as population implosion, meaning the population is contracting and cannot regenerate itself without some type of intervention. That fertility rate continued to decline in 19, 20. There was a little bump upwards a year after COVID. I guess lockup caused a lot of people to get involved intimately, but immediately going back to those prior trends. I want to look at this generationally. And you can see baby boomers, hence the name of the generation, the baby boom. Look at the fertility rates, above 3.5%, pushing up near 4, or 3.5, pushing up to 4, well above replacement age. And look at what's happened over time. They've collapsed and they've essentially flatlined below the 2.1 minimum replacement. And look at post 2008, the economic crash. They have been declining ever since. You want to know why my childhood neighborhood in the 1970s was full of school-aged children? It's because of the high fertility rate. You want to know why that neighborhood today has no children in it, or very few children in enrollments? It's because the low fertility rate. We thought the millennials, a large generational cohort, was going to turn this around, or at least that's what a lot of demographers thought. This big cohort of young persons in their 20s and 30s were going to have a bunch of children, and we'd get another, rise in school-age children and enrollments. But what we see is, while they peaked at the same age, around 28 or so, for peak fertility and having children, they peaked lower than Generation X. That is, they're having, at each interval, they are having fewer children, except for up here, a little bit older, than the generation before them. Therefore, the millennials haven't produced as many children. If we look over here at age versus year, look at 1985. The younger cohorts are kind of driving births, right? Birthing ages. If you then look at 2015, you start to see that it's the older cohorts. So not only are we having fewer children, we're having children at a later age, which further contributes to the further children. And we see the average age for first-time mothers is 27.3. Demographically, ethnically across populations, and you see white women at 28.1 for age, and then lower ages on ethnic minority groups. So this is US population from 1950 to 2010, and then projected out to 2050, a projection that I think still holds very accurate as projections can be. What's interesting here is look after 2010, the over 65 population more than doubles. While we only have a 16% increase in the 15 to 64 and a 17% increase in the under 15 population. This is a shift in our demographics. We are aging. And much of this growth or increase in these lower ages is actually being driven by immigration, not by a rate of natural increase, because our fertility rates are down at, what had I said, 1.64 in 2020. So it's immigration that's driving population growth, not natural increase through births. It's one of my favorite graphics. I've actually been using it since 2012. I'll qualify it up until today because it still holds true. But ultimately, change in demographics are changing the way we live, we work, we socialize, we recreate, how we consume, and even the homes we buy or rent. And look at this, in 1970, 40% of couples were married couples, 40% of households were married couples with children, down to 19.6 in 2012 and down to 19 in 2020. But look what happened to the single person household. Went from about 17% of total households to over 27% of total households. The most interesting in this context is the fact that married couples with children statistically stays constant over this period. So we have fewer married couples with children, and we have many more single person households than ever before. And we then see that in this graphic, which is doing household size. Single person households have been on the rise since 1970. Two person households have also been on the rise marginally. And 3, 4, and 5 or more person households have been on decline. Are you wondering why my parents' neighborhood no longer has a bunch of school-aged children? Because there's very few 5 or more person households within that neighborhood. Look at that decrease from 21% of total households down to less than 10%. From 2010 to 2020, parents living with children under the age of 18 declined by 3 million. 28% of our households in 2020 were one-person households. That's up from 13% in 1960. Think about that in the context of school-aged children. 20% of America's households cannot produce any school-aged children because they're just single person. 33% of adults age 15 and over have never been married. I'm not advocating 15-year-olds to get married, but that's the way the data is calculated. That's up from 23% in 1950. So you see we're marrying later. And the median age to marry for the first time is up to 30.5 for men, 28.1 for women, and that's up from 23.7 and 20.5 respectively since 1947. That's a dramatic change. And over half, 58% of adults 18 to 24 live in their parental home, up from 55% in 2019. That's a tremendous stat also, this idea of the failure to launch, that young people are just staying in their parental household longer and longer. It also means there's pent-up demand in the housing market for those new household formations. So what's causing this once again? As an advanced economy, we marry less, we marry later, we have fewer children. And fewer children means fewer school district enrollments. So that's on the national level. Let's look at the Connecticut perspective. Two population charts, pyramids, 2000 for Connecticut. And my main thing here is to show Generation X. If you remember back in the 2000s, if you're old enough, through the 1990s, we struggled to retain and attract 20-something-year-olds. And you can see that contraction in the Gen X population. You can also see, I put at 3% these vertical lines showing how these age cohorts are going out beyond 3%. Move down to 2020 and look what's happened to this pyramid. It's siloed. You can see this cohort, the 20 to 24. You can see it here now at 40 to 44. Still that contraction. But look at very few age cohorts, except for the older baby boom population, are going out over 3%. And we've siloed at the bottom. So truly stage 4. Low birth rates, low death rates, little to no natural increase. Connecticut's population, total population increased from 2010 to 2020 by 1%. You can see the metropolitan counties, Fairfield, Hartford, New Haven, fared better than what I would call the non-metropolitan ones that lost total population. Adult population 18 and over increased by 4% across the board in all counties, showing that we're aging. And look what happened to the less than 18 population. 10% loss statewide, and between 6% and 19% going by counties. We are shedding young people over that decade. That is this declining fertility rate. Connecticut 1.51, much lower than the state. If we then go on to here, this is non-Hispanic white population. So essentially the Caucasian population. Look at across the board, 2010 to 2020 change. 10% down on total, 6% down on adult, and 27% down on young persons. The fact is, our population growth is primarily being driven by immigration and therefore a higher occurrence of minorities. When we look at birth rates by race, we see Black and Hispanic populations and Asian populations accounting for more births than their share of the population. And we see the white population accounting for fewer births than their share of the population statewide. So if you are a suburban community that's mostly white, I can assure you your fertility rate is lower than the 1.51 statewide. Look at our household occupancy characteristics. Total households. Above the national average of 28%, we have 30% single-person households and 33.6 two-person households. But look, when you go over here to the renter households, and the greatest aversion in the housing market is to multifamily rentals, right? 45.2% of renter households are single, and 26.9 are two persons. Very unlikely, school age children generation and enrollment. So approximately 72% of multifamily housing has very little chance of generating any meaningful enrollment. You want to know where your enrollments are coming from? It's the 4 or more person households that are owner occupied. And we'll see that more in some other data. Look at our housing permit data over this kind of same period of time, going 1960s to now. When Connecticut's population was growing at a rapid rate, we built a lot of houses, between 20 and 25,000 per year. We also built a lot of multifamily back in the 60s and 70s. Excuse me. You then see the economic woes of the 70s and the slowdown, and then you see the boom of the 80s and another slowdown, and we never recover from that 1989, 1990 housing market crash and then recession from a housing permit perspective. We also see that, look at this, the multifamily goes away. It becomes, a small share of total housing production. Through the early 2000s, it's probably mostly age restricted because no one wanted school age children. 2008 housing market crash, sorry, 2009 recession, and we collapse again and don't recover. But there is a shift. You can see here that multifamily becomes about 40% of the market share on new construction. And that's our demographic change. It's this increase in single and two-person households that needs a different housing product. And you can see our anemic population growth in recent times. It matches ultimately with what our permit data shows us. The prior one ended in 2018, and I just want to show you that the multifamily housing share is still maintaining a higher proportion out into 2021. The slowdown may actually be more economic than a shift in the market. We'll have to see where those trends continue. So a couple case studies, places I've done work in. Granby, I did a bunch of demographic analysis and looking at kind of fiscal impacts related to something with enrollments, and I'll get to that as I go through this. But Granby, a community of 11,000 persons in 2010, lost total population, slight increase in adult population, they are aging, and 19% loss ultimately in under 18 population. And look at, once again, the white population, down 9%, down 3%, down 29%. These are our shifts and changes in households, our ethnic makeups, and so forth. Take a look at their population pyramid. They're worried about increasing enrollments due to new housing development. They have no 30-something-year-olds to produce children. Not that they have no, but look at this contraction. They cannot retain and attract young households. This is the population that will produce the next generation of children. This is why this is contracting inwards and will continue to, because that child rearing population is not there and they are aging, right? So they'll continue to contract. They lack millennials. There's so few people in the 20 to 44 population who will produce the next generation. Age 55 and down to 30 is contracting in. It's an inverted pyramid, and the future doesn't look great from a population perspective. This is Middlefield. I could go through dozens of communities, but I recently did some work in Middlefield. This is 2023. Talk about top heavy with an aging population, lack of child rearing population, contracting school age children. Compared to a projection for 2028, their pyramid is inverting. They're not going to be adding school age children. Stonington, Connecticut, want to see an inverted pyramid? Look at 2028. That's a population in collapse. Look at them compared to the county. Far more of these age groups in the county than there actually is in Stonington itself. This was from a housing market study we did for the River Cog, the lower Connecticut River Valley Cog. Look at their population change, non-metropolitan region, under 18. Look at this, 29%, 32%, 29%, 30%, region-wide 19%. Look at the school enrollments, down 41%. Sorry, that's supposed to be negative, not positive. And 46%, 44%. I was just doing some calculations from Westbrook. They're now at 44%. Total collapse in school age population across that entire region. So Cheshire, I'm now a resident of Cheshire. It's in your region. I figured I'd include it, and I'll come back to it at the end of the presentation. But look at Cheshire 2022. Lacking in that child rearing population. Look at 2028 and this continued contraction on the younger age cohorts. So back to Granby. So looking at the tenancy, the occupancy of the housing stock, it's overwhelmingly owner occupied, and it's 84% 3 or more bedrooms. That's a housing stock built for families with children, but they're losing children. Why? Because we don't have 40% of the households being married couples with children anymore, only 19%. And those households are big, those housing units are big, they're expensive, and they're outside the reach of the 20 and 30 something year olds who may be getting married and may be having children, and therefore their enrollments are collapsing. Their existing housing stock is mostly designed for families with school-age children, for past generations. They do great if it was 1976 again, but they struggle today in 2024. This is their housing unit production by year cohorts. And the main thing I just want to point to here is look at the change in the marketplace after 2008. The market share of multifamily, 45% between 2008 and 17, and then 62.5%. This is the shift in our demographics. This is the 29.9% single person households that our elderly population and our young population need a different housing stock. In the multifamily housing market, especially the rental market, is fulfilling that void. So let's start thinking about this in other ways, the fiscal impacts of this. So housing production from 2007 to 2017 in Granby was a net gain of 130 units. Based on their existing 0.42 enrollments per unit, you could assume that housing would produce 55 school enrollments. But from that, over that same time period, they lost 610 students, 25% decrease in enrollments. The fact that the enrollments declined while new housing was added should question the assumption that new housing is the primary driver of school enrollments. They added new housing and their enrollments collapsed. That's the demographic force. Now look at their budget. Budget increase from 26.5 million to 30 million over that same period of time by $3.4 million. But they lost 470 enrollments over that period of time. Essentially, the budget increased 7,000 per enrollment loss. What's going on here? Budgets are not being driven by enrollments. It's other things that drive these budgets. So new housing is not the primary driver of enrollments, nor are enrollments the primary driver of educational spending. If we adjust for inflation, the 2007 budget with the 2017 budget, we actually see that the BOE increases were at a rate below inflation, 1.3 million less than inflation over that period. So they're not spending recklessly, right? If we then bring back the 2007 enrollments and we divide them into the 2017 budget, look at the change in the per pupil spending. It drops from 16,000 per pupil down to 12,008. What's happening is with per pupil spending is we're capitalizing more costs in the fewer students. That's why the per pupil number is getting so high. Town I'm working in right now has a per pupil spending over $30,000 per pupil, but their enrollment has collapsed by 40%. So the fact is, actually, if you added students back up, your per pupil would come down. Now, would your total education costs go up? Yes, there would be some increases. But it's time that we put away the myth that new housing drives education costs and taxes behind us. We need to end the practice of fiscal zoning. If Granby is to prosper, it needs young persons, young families, and school-aged children. It can't continue on that trajectory, that population structure is not working. So let's think about some of these costs. And this isn't anti-sports, but it's a way to get a point across. In 1970s, when I was a young kid playing pee-wee football, my sister was a cheerleader. Gender roles. My sister cheerleaded, I played sports. Today, everyone plays sports. So your high school now has boys teams and girls teams, right? Your demand on ball fields across the town have quadrupled, with the amount of, you've got men's leagues, girls leagues, women's leagues, kids, pee-wees, all that. My high school didn't have a lighted football field when I was in high school in the 1980s, but now everyone wants to play under the lights on Monday nights, on Friday nights, so we add lighting. We now play lacrosse. We didn't used to play lacrosse. There's new sports that have been added. This isn't picking on sports, but it's to show the demands on our parks and rec, the demands on our school systems are far different and far greater than they were generations ago, because we have changed societally and we expect more in different things. So housing enrollments, multifamily housing enrollments and fiscal impacts. I got to work on the POCD in 2019 for the town of Ellington. We took a look at 86% of their total multifamily. These were all the large developments. What we don't have in here is the missing middle. We don't have the 2s, the 3s, the 4s. So 1,862 units produced from the Board of Ed, 295 enrollments, or equal to 0.158 enrollments per unit across 1,862 units. If you think multifamily housing is driving your education, enrollments and budgets, it's not. South Windsor's a unique community. Their peak enrollment was in 2005. Their enrollment collapsed to 2015. They lost almost 1,000 enrollments. Since 2015, they've almost gained all that enrollment back. They've been growing. They're one of the few towns, look at positive population growth, positive adult growth, and not a decline on young children. They've been doing year-over-year studies and tracking new housing and existing housing and how enrollments are playing out. Single family housing, new development, is producing around 1 enrollment per unit. Condo multifamily is producing about 0.62. Another single family, 1. But look at the multifamily. These are 50-50 splits of 1 and 2 bedrooms, 0.18, 0.17. Over this 9-year period, they've been as low as 0.13 and as high as 0.24. But basically, you have 1 enrollment per 4 or 5 units of multifamily. Do the math. If you're getting 10,000 per unit on a single family, and you're getting 5,000 per unit on a multifamily, right? Your 5 multifamily units produce $25,000 in taxes for 1 student versus the single family produces $10,000 in taxes for 1.6 students. Your multifamily is fiscally positive. So as part of the work in Granby, just as a hypothetical, I took these 4 developments in the Hartford region, 4 different towns, knew the unit count, had actual enrollments from them from prior work I had done, used their actual town appraised value, assessed value, applied the Granby mill rate, and you come up with total taxes on 584 units of 2.8 million. Apply the residential taxes, apply the motor vehicle taxes, then apply the expenses of enrollments, the cost of general government services, and these 4 units combined together end up fiscally positive. Part of the work in Granby was around an elementary school property that they wanted to sell. So we did a hypothetical build out based on zoning. We assumed 100 units could be yielded, 10% studio, then 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom. These are the calculations explained, the enrollments explained, 413,000 in property taxes and 213,000 net positive. I've done dozens and dozens of these. I've gone back and checked enrollments after the fact, and the story remains the same. The multifamily development is fiscally positive. So I'll end in Cheshire. One, because it's in the region, two, because I live here, and three, because I've been involved in the North End development known as Stonebridge Crossing. We assisted with the master plan approval. We also assisted with the credit enhancement agreement, and we worked on the individual land use approvals for this residential component, and also for the plaza here. Just to show you, these were our original numbers that we projected for the fiscal impacts. And each of the residential segments, including the active adult, which isn't under construction yet, are fiscally positive in and of their own rights. This is under development right now. I believe from town staff, it's actually generating fewer enrollments than I had projected about 4 years ago. And the total development, now including all the phases, all the build out, ultimately net fiscal positive of 1.7 million, this being mixed use, not just simply multifamily. The end conclusions here, when population ages as Connecticut is, fertility rates and births decline. When children decline, school enrollments decline. Most school districts in Connecticut have been declining or stagnating with their enrollments. Few districts will return to their prior peaks. The fertility rate overall just doesn't allow it, and our job growth is anemic, as is our population growth. For the school districts with increasing enrollments, most of the new enrollments are due to turnover in the existing single-family housing stock. It's when the retirees sell and move or pass away, and a new family occupies the house. But the chances are that house will generate fewer enrollments today than it did 4 decades ago. So it's not new housing, especially not multifamily, that's driving enrollments or the budget, education budgets. Education costs are rising regardless of declining or stagnation. Per pupil expenditures are increasing due to rises in costs, but also the cost being spread across fewer enrollments. Connecticut needs more housing, especially housing product better suited for single and 2-person households. We have a ton of 3-bedroom plus households, but right now, over 50% of the households, or near 50% of households, are single and 2-person households. We need a housing stock to meet those households. In Connecticut, and we need to stop the practice of fiscal zoning. We need to embrace changing demographics in a changing housing market. Resistance isn't the option. You can't stop these demographic forces. You can't stop these market forces. And the fact is we need to embrace change. So with that, I will thank you. And I will turn it back to SN for any questions.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Cullen. It's really important information for all of us to be getting. And so I think I can say for myself as a housing planner, I understood the housing piece and I understood the demographic piece, but I didn't see the way in which they connected. And I think your presentation does a really strong job of helping people make that connection. So thank you. Thank you so much. We have a question. Have you ever looked to see if students in new housing developments are new to the district or may have already been in the district but moved within the town, i.e. is the impact even lower than these calculations?
Yeah, if you'll go through my Granby slides where I had detailed calculations, in general, we found that for most communities, in most cases, only between kind of 15 and 30% of enrollments from a new development are new to the district. The vast majority, we'll say 70%, are actually from within the district. Where we may see some anomalies. So I usually calculate 50% new to district to A, provide a cushion, and B, assume that there may be some backfill into those units with some enrollments when that, moving shift occurs. Where there may be some anomalies to that is when a community has very few rental housing units. So if you have 90% single family and only 10% rental, and you add, 100 units of rental housing, you're probably more likely to get a higher percentage of new to district just because the lack of renters already existing within your community.
Hopeful. Are there any notable differences when looking at our cities?
Yes and no. On the housing side and the household size, you will find in the urban centers, you'll find higher percentages of single person. You will also probably find higher percentages of households with children in the rental community that's ethnically and economically driven. Uh, but as far as contracting enrollments go, the cities have seen declines as much as the suburbs and rural communities have. And if they're not in decline, then they're experiencing stagnation. I think the most dramatic numbers, as you saw in those charts, are really the non-metropolitan areas and communities, the Litchfields and the Wyndhams, that just can't attract and retain 20 and 30 something year olds, and therefore just aging out, and their young person populations are collapsing. It's a real struggle.
We have a question from Carol. Will the slides and/or recording of this excellent presentation be made available? And we also saw the excellent presentations in the chat. So thank you, everybody. Yes, the slides will be made available. We will put the slides and the presentation on our website, and then we'll follow up with attendees once that's been finalized. I'll also take this opportunity to say thank you again to the Connecticut chapter of the American Planning Association. This event is eligible for CM credit, so if you are a certified planner, please make sure to find it in your CM log and record this event.
We have a question from Cameron who says, does larger single family produce more birth rates, or is it that larger families want to go to these places? If we do want to balance out our population, should we be focused on these larger single family houses, or do the multifamily houses provide more stable growth?
So I think at the end of the day, I think it's diversity. I think after 1989, we got away from producing multifamily housing, and we lost the diversity in housing. And when we did build multifamily in the early 2000s, we restricted it to active adult. And so therefore, I think we've created a housing stock that doesn't meet our population needs. So I think we need a greater diversity in housing. So my advice would be, developers kind of know what the market is driving and work with them when they come forward with applications. They're not going to propose something that's not going to sell. So whether it be single family or multifamily, both. But at the end of the day, my biggest concern is the opposition to multifamily as if it's going to bust the school system. It is the product that generates the least amount of enrollments. Now, back to the first part of your question on household size and so forth. As income rise, so there's some correlations in demographics and housing structure and school and children or birth rates. Minority populations tend to have higher fertility rates, as we saw. Poorer populations tend to have higher fertility rates, as we saw. And as you go up in income, you typically see a decline in fertility rates and decline in children. But that being said, when you start overlaying that demographic and economic data onto a housing market, you will start to find that your 4 and 5 bedroom houses are actually producing the highest number of school enrollments. enrollments. That's because households that can afford a $750,000 house can also afford to have 2 or 3 children. And that 4 bedroom or 5 bedroom house meets the need of that household. So there's a little distortion that occurs in there when you start getting into that larger, higher cost product.
Awesome. Kenneth is asking, what might be the best way to make the local population aware of the housing versus education conversation?
Best way to make them aware, programs like this as a start. This will be available. I think referring them to the COG and viewing this or access to those slides. Engaging in conversations. I think conversations between boards of ed and planning and zoning commissions are extremely important. I've stood before and worked with planning and zoning commissions that believe the sky is falling on enrollments because of housing. And when they then meet with their board of ed and actually talk with them, they then find out that the board of ed is, even though they haven't believed me telling them their enrollments are collapsing, when they finally talk with their peers on the board of ed who say, we've got declining enrollments and we're thinking about shutting a school and those cross-commission, cross-purpose, conversations, I think are extremely important. And engaging the public in them as often as possible is as important.
I have a question. Have you looked and made a link to the cost of single-family housing units? Are towns with more affordable single units growing?
Single-family housing as affordable, I don't think is increasing in numbers or percent. It's extremely, if you're referring to like 8-30G affordability, it's extremely difficult to actually have a financially feasible, affordable housing single family product. It's challenging, but becomes more feasible in the multifamily realm of the marketplace. So I think you're seeing that shift more in the multifamily. They're just multifamily in general, especially rentals, are more affordable, and they become a more affordable product overall.
Okay, we'll do one more question. Thank you everyone for all the questions. Among coastal Connecticut municipalities, we are anecdotally seeing a significant number of new residents with children. Given the circumstances over the past 4 years, COVID, born out of state, not attending daycare, how are these demographics being counted? How are school districts planning for children who may be enrolling over the next 4 to 8 years?
Yeah, so it's easy to calculate the natural increase, births plus, births minus deaths and what's going on within that population. The toughest thing to measure is actually the turnover in existing housing stock. So for those communities that are experiencing increases or anticipating increases with shifts in the housing market, the post-COVID world, it's your existing, 3+ bedroom unit, single family detached housing that's most likely driving your enrollments. You can't, there's no way to gauge the timing of when a unit's going to sell or who's going to purchase it and how it's going to occupy. But the higher quality your education system is, the more likely that housing stock is to attract a household with children. My argument is you can't stop it. There's no way to stop it. You have to embrace it. But a way to offset it is to actually approve more multifamily housing, because the taxes being a fiscal positive on the multifamily will offset the growing demands on housing on the single family side. That example of my parents' neighborhood, my childhood neighborhood, when you do the fiscal impact in 1976, that neighborhood is like a net negative of like $1.7 million per year in today's dollars. And with only 14 enrollments today, it's still a net negative of like $47,000 today. The single family housing stock is never going to be fiscally positive based on the amount of enrollments it generates. That being said, I don't think we should start prohibiting single family housing stock. It's still a needed product. So we've got to figure out how to best manage our budgets while providing a diversity of housing and a new housing stock.
We do have one last question, which is, does the enrollment projection for apartments and or townhomes have any correlation with community affluence? I'm curious if there is higher student enrollment where the community has higher affluence and often a higher performing school system.
Across the board, I mean, I've done these projections in all different communities, and I don't see a dramatic difference. I don't see any meaningful difference in the generation on the multifamily rental product. Townhome developments typically have more 3-bedroom units than a garden style apartment building. So the 3 bedrooms will usually add a little bit to the enrollment numbers. But once again, it's in the single family existing stock where those numbers are changing. One other note I want to make, everyone, because I use it and everyone refers back to it, the 2006 Rutgers study on enrollment projections. And if you go in, the Rutgers study breaks out the enrollments not only by unit types and bedrooms, but also by sales value. And there's some kind of correlations in that data between the value of the unit and the enrollments coming out of that unit. What I've learned over now, 15 years of using that data is the averages, not the by value, are the more accurate numbers. If you use the by value numbers, if you say we're going to get an enrollment of point X based on a $500,000 plus unit, that number is more likely to be wrong than if you just use the average projection for a 4-bedroom unit, whatever it may be. And that's why I don't think there's that much change in income. I will say once again, just another qualifier, Class B DIRGs being the higher rating, or the Class A DIRGs being the higher educational ratings. The stronger your school system is, the more likely your existing housing stock and new housing stock will attract enrollments. But if it's mostly 1 and 2 bedrooms on the new product, then your enrollments will still stay very low. Sorry for the long answer.
No, we cannot thank you enough. We will share the link to the Rutgers study when we follow up. And a DIRG, that's what we'll end on. Someone asked what's a DIRG, just so we're all on the same page.
I forget what the exact acronym DIRG is for, because I've
We'll
been using
follow up on it.
some. Yeah. So
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for this really wonderful presentation. We're so thankful to have had you here with us today.
thank you. I appreciate it. And a quick hello to Cameron. Good to see you, Cameron.
It is a district reference group. That's the answer. Thank you,
Yes.
attendees.
Thank you.
We
Thank you.
crowdsource. That's what MBCOG is, a community. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye-bye.